Now, this evening, the sermon that I'm trying to do, often when you come with a sermon, you're trying to evoke a response, and often an emotional response. You're trying to maybe help someone have a realization of God's love for them, and then that would change the way that they see themselves or see other people around them or the culture around them, and that would then lead to some application there. Or another case, maybe it's the faithfulness of God and leading us to go, oh, wow, I can really trust this God. And so that's where that journey will go. Or maybe even next week with the resurrection, it's like, oh, there's hope in places where I didn't think there would be hope. And off you go down that line. This evening, I'm not trying to evoke one of those responses, I suppose, and it's quite confusing as to what I'm trying to do. But I think what I'm trying to do is elevate our view of the Bible. We're going to look at 5 fairly obscure verses at the back of Exodus 15. If you're a Bible person, that's where we're going. And my hope and prayer is that we would see the Bible as a document that's doing a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, and the way that it does them is in itself incredible. I think, in my experiences at least, the Bible cops a fair bit. Certainly from those outside the church, but also from those inside the church. And it's my hope to show that what these authors are doing is just simply magnificent. That's where we're going, which is a weird application, but there's where we're going. If we get there, let me know. Now, some of you, I suppose this journey started maybe 12 months ago, but really solidified for me late last year as I started doing this Jonah course. And there's a page and a half of my Bible, and a guy is teaching me and opening this book up and showing me what the author is trying to do. And I ended up writing way too many words on it, like probably 10 times the length of the book. And then you sit there and be like, wow. And now my realization is all the authors are doing this all the time with all the books. And I just need eyes to see what they're trying to do. So that's my learning, and I'm on a learning journey. How good. And I'm inviting you to come and take a few steps on this learning journey with me. So let's read where we are. So Moses, Exodus 15:22. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur, and for 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, which means bitter, they could not drink its water because it was Marah. It was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we going to drink?" And Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. And he threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. And there the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I won't bring any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to a place called Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. I read this passage to the young adults last week. How exciting. Told them this passage tells the whole story of the Bible in 5 verses. And now they're here, so I have to prove it, which is I was hoping they weren't be here, and it's going to be easy. What these Old Testament authors and the New Testament authors, what the authors of the Bible are trying to do is a great many things. Here, they're starting by trying to tell a narrative, a story. So that's sort of one symbol that they're trying to do. Then, on top of that, they're in oral tradition at this point, so they've got to make this narrative quite easy to remember and recall. So that's the second sort of plate they got spinning, if you will. Then they're trying to make a theological point in the story. So that's 3 plates on the go. Then, after that, they're trying to fit this theological point into the greater theological point. Sometimes that crosses 3 or 4 stories. Sometimes that's a whole book. So we'll call that a 4th plate that they've got going. And then after that, and what I'm starting to learn is these authors are trying to link these stories together so that when I read one story, actually I'm reading 3 or 4 different stories. And each one of these stories plays around with the other one and is trying to teach me something from them. 5 plates on the go, and they're doing this 4,000 years ago. Let me give you a few examples of where you might see a case like this. 2 Samuel 11 is David and Bathsheba, famous story. Okay, the one before that. Is there the one before that, Lara? Yes, here it is. It starts in the springtime, at the time when kings go off to war. David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. But David remained in Jerusalem. It's how the passage starts. Now, we know where it ends. If you played along with David and Bathsheba, it ends with adultery, murder, and a huge black mark over David. Now, this is how it starts, though. And really interestingly, at no point does the narrator particularly condemn what David is doing. It just says, in the springtime, when kings go off to war, David stayed at home. It's odd, but is it bad? It's the question the author is trying to get you to ask. Why did David stay home? Is it good that he stayed home? But the passage doesn't tell you in and of itself. What it's asking you to do is think about other stories of kings, or when a king or someone who tells you what the kings are going to be like, and that will help define it for you. And so then, when you go and look at Samuel, who talks about what the king was going to be like, when the people first came up in 1 Samuel 7 and said, we want a king, we want to be like all the other nations, that's not good for a start, because God's trying to call them to be different to other nations, but they want a king. And so he sits there and tells them what the king is going to be like, and how each king will, in their own way, abuse the power that God has given them. They will send your young people off to war. They will take from you and abuse what is their power. What's happening here is the narrator is trying to allude back to that and show you, this is the first time that David, he should have gone to war. In the springtime, when the kings go to war, David, he stayed home. It's odd, and what he's trying to help you realize, 1 Samuel 7, is that it's not good. The story continues, and David sees Bathsheba, and she's on a roof, and he's on his roof, and he looks, and he thinks, gee, she's beautiful. And he goes and gets his men to go pick her up and bring her to him. The 2 words here, or the 2 phrases that are key here, is he sees a woman who was literally good to his eye, pleasing to the sight, is another way we might read it. And so he sent his men out to take her. And again, these authors are trying to help you think of a passage. Is there another passage I can think of where something was pleasing to their eye and they took it? How good? The Garden of Eden. Where Eve sees the apple. It was literally good to her sight in the Hebrew, and so she took it. Turns out this is a really common way that Bible authors are trying to make you see that this is a failure moment for them. It happens with Achan. They're outside Jericho. God says, don't take any of the jewelry, any of the fine metals. Leave them all. Achan sees the gold, sees that it was pleasing in his sight, and he takes it. Literally the same phrase. Abraham and his wife Sarah, God gives them a promise, you're going to have a baby. A promise, they're not sure that how it's going to work. Well, they see Abraham's servant, and it's pleasing in their sight to take her and give her to Abraham. And out of that we get Ishmael and a fractured family. Again, another full moment. It's the same phrase. We see it again. We're going to see it in Exodus 34. One of the biggest failure moments Israel faces, they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses is making the deal with God up the mountain. And down the bottom, Aaron sees the gold that the Israelites are bringing him, and it's good to him, and he builds the golden calf. He takes it and builds the calf. It's the same language. In all of these, they're trying to link these stories together to show you that what is happening at the Garden of Eden is happening right here, right now, but it's not there until you look for it. Patterns run through all the way through Scripture. Another pattern, maybe one that we've seen, just as we've been studying Exodus. It starts with Moses. He is put into the waters of death as a baby, put in the word is ark. How interesting, trying to pull Noah into this sort of thing. But there's Moses in the waters of death, taken out, grows up in the palace, sent out into the wilderness, And in the wilderness there, he travels to Sinai where he meets with God. In the same way, the Israelites are going to head through the waters of death into the wilderness up to Sinai where they will meet with God. Can you see that they're playing off each other? It's the same story told with different characters. These patterns are happening through the Bible if you are looking for them. And I believe our story is playing into one of these patterns. And so I'm going to try and, in a reasonable time, demonstrate the pattern, show a few versions of it, and then we're going to exegete our passage, and then finally we're going to get to an application in 5 minutes. Here we go. Try and keep up. Otherwise, I encourage you, go and have a look at the stories. Our pattern is going to start in the garden again. Eden, we don't have time for this, but it was a high place. It's not in the text, but it's a place where 4 rivers are, and they flow out to the world. And so it makes sense in a Jewish cosmology, their picture of what the world was. Eden was a high place where they met with God. Now from there, the rivers flow down. At the top of Eden and in the center of the garden is a tree, or 2 trees. And at these 2 trees, or if we go to the next one, it's going to help us a bit. Here we go. One more. Right, next to the tree of life, they are meeting with God next to a tree, and there is a life or death choice that faces Adam and Eve. And should they make the right choice, they will continue to receive the blessings of Eden. But if they fail this choice, then these blessings will be removed from them. This is the start of the pattern. 2 people, a group of people, top of a high place, meeting with God, having some sort of test before them where life and death comes, and if they pass the test, there's an Eden blessing. The next time we see this is with Noah. He's at the top of Mount Ararat. The floods have just come down. The ark has stopped. He gets off the boat. Now he's at a high place. There's a whole bunch of wood around him, and out of that ark, he seems to make an altar. Again, if we flick to the next one, we should see. He's then interceding with God for humanity at a high place next to a whole pile of wood, and out of that comes a blessing for Noah. If you recall, we talked about this in Genesis 6. The only difference between how God describes humans before the flood and after the flood, the only thing that's different is that God has spelled a sacrifice. God condemns humans, says their hearts are full of wickedness and evil, and that's the reason for the flood. It's the same reason after the flood that he says he will not flood it again. The only difference being Noah made a sacrifice at a high place. He's interceding with God. And then out of that comes this blessing on Noah. God says to him, go, be fruitful and multiply. Again, a key phrase that we find in the garden story, trying to link these stories together. We keep going. Abraham comes next. If you remember Genesis 22, he goes up the mountain with Isaac. What's on Isaac's back? The wood for the offering. They get up to the top of the mountain. And there we find out this is really clear that God is testing Abraham. It's how the story starts. God tested Abraham and said, go and sacrifice your son to me. At the top of the mountain, therefore, we see again Abraham making a life and death choice. Wood is on top of the mountain. Not only that, wood starts, the way they describe it is there was wood on Isaac's back, and as you get to the top, wood is like every second word. They take the wood off Isaac's back and put it on the altar, and then put Isaac on the wood on the altar. And then after that, look, there's a tree over there. The word wood is the word eights, and it's the same word for wood, branch, and tree. So there's eights, it's the Hebrew word, and it's all over this passage. They're trying to get you to see there's trees here on this high place, again, there's a life or death choice. There's a test before him. Should you pass the test, there is a blessing for you, and Abraham does. He passes the test. They sacrifice what God provided for them, and out of that comes a confirmation of the blessing on Abraham, And what is that blessing? It's the blessing of Eden on Abraham. God has chosen him to carry this Eden blessing to the world. He's still with me. I hope so. I hope the pattern is forming. You can see there's a few differences. We'll talk about those in a minute. The next one is Moses. Again, he's in the wilderness. This time he's in the wilderness. He's at the top of Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb is what it's called. It's the same mountain. There it's the burning bush, right? It's the same word, eights. Burning tree. There's Moses meeting with God. And it is again a test for Moses. Will you trust God? It's the question that Moses is being asked. And if you trust him, then he will lead Israel out, and once again, they will hold the Eden blessing for the nations. Each one of these, each time the pattern repeats itself, it's got sort of 4 out of the 5 things, if you see. It's because each time it's trying to bring in a different picture. It's trying to help you unpack the pattern. Adam and Eve, yes, as we look back from Abraham, we see that is definitely a test. It was a test before them, and yet Noah, it's a moment of intercession. How does that work? Well, the authors are trying to help you see that what's before Noah again is a test. He's walked off the ark with not many animals, and the question is, how are you going to deal with your animals? Are you going to sacrifice them to me? Or are you going to hold on to the little wealth you have? I think the question that Moses is asked out of it all is, will you trust me? Sort of reverberates through all of these 4 stories. Will you trust me in Adam and Eve for me to give you the wisdom? For Noah, it's, will you trust me in the animals that you've got? Again, with Abraham, is, will you trust me? If I give you a promise of your son, you've already tried to take that promise for your own. Will you now trust me with the promise? Or are you going to hold on to your own wisdom? Into this pattern, we're going to we find our story. If you're still with me, which I hope you are. Where are we? Israel, they've just walked through the sea, and they've just written this song, the Song of the Sea, Miriam's song, and they're singing this song about how great God is, and how he's got power over the sea, and how he's just washed away the Egyptians. And as the chords of that song seem to fade, so does Israel's faith. They walk 3 days into the desert. They come across this pool of waters, and the pool the water is bitter. It's death waters. But what we'd hope for them to remember is God just walked them through death waters. He just took them through the waters of death, parting them, and he's got power over the waters. So our hope is that they see these waters and go immediately, God, you are the God of death waters. Come and make life out of these. Instead, they get all grumpy, which is another pattern in and of itself that you could follow for a fair bit. Moses then cries out to the Lord. This is classic intercession language. Absolutely. If someone is crying out to the Lord on behalf of a people, they're interceding. It's really common intercession language. And so he's interceding with God for his people. And this is the start of the pattern. So what sort of things are we looking for? Well, we're looking for a tree to appear in the story. And lo, God shows Moses a branch, a piece of wood, an eighth, a tree. And he casts it into the waters. And the waters, the death waters, are turned to life. The next line, we find out that this was all a test, which is absolutely fitting in with our pattern of God is testing the Israelites. Will you trust me? Or are you going to live in your own wisdom? But Israel failed the test. They grumbled and they groaned. But here, where Israel failed, one righteous man passed the test. And he passed it on all of their behalf. And so God leads them to a place called Elim. And this place of Elim, there's 12 springs and there's 70 palm trees. Well, there's 12 tribes. There's a spring for each tribe, and there's 70 palm strings. There's 7 and 10, two very classic biblical words for abundance and perfection. There's enough. It's a micro Eden hidden in the wilderness where there's shade and water for everyone. Why? Because one man passed the test. Everyone gets access to Eden. Are you with me? Because as you realize, you say that line, there's a test before humanity that which we have failed. But one righteous man passed the test on behalf of us at a high place with a tree nearby, life or death, and because of that, we all get to access an Eden-like blessing. Are you with me? Do you see how this story is telling the story of the Bible? Because we're doing it next week. Thursday, there's Jesus in the garden on Mount Olives, trees all around him. And what's he doing? He is being tested. Will you trust me? And what does he say? Take this cup, if there's any other way. But not my will, but yours. And he passes the test the next day on a different hill, raised up on a tree. There he is passing the test, and because of his death, we all have access to Eden. Five obscure verses hidden in the back of Exodus 15 telling the story of the Bible, of a test involving some wood and life and death. And what I'm discovering is all of these stories are doing this all the time. What's the point? I mean, the point is this Bible is incredible. This was written 2,000 years before Jesus. Someone can give me the right number, but it's around there. And what we start to see is God didn't just think, oh my goodness, these humans, they're sinning. I've got to fix this. This was a plan that came about a long time ago. Before they first looked at the fruit and it was good in their eyes, he knew what was going to happen. And he is orchestrating it all. I just find that so beautiful. And so, I suppose my application is, would you come and read the Bible and discover how amazing this book is again? Some of us have been reading it for decades, well longer than I. And maybe this stuff is old news to you, and beautiful it is. I'd love to sit down with you. I'm just starting to discover is that it is asking me to come and to search it, to meditate on it, to sit with it, to know it. To know it. A thought to finish on as we sort of close this section of Exodus, though. God here tests Israel. And we saw last week, he tests them again. And will keep testing them. Each day, we are faced with choices of whose wisdom are we going to live in. Am I going to live in my wisdom? Or will I wait for his wisdom? Am I going to trust in his faithfulness for me? Am I going to trust that he will provide what I need? Will I sing songs where it says, when darkness seems to hide his face, I'll rest on his unchanging grace? Will I sing that song and do it? Or will I leave it at the words? The words of the Lord in verse 26, it says, if you listen carefully, or if you listen, that's what it says. If you listen and do what's right in his eyes, if you're obedient to him, if you trust him, then he'll lead you into the Eden blessing, a place of rest and abundance in the wilderness. And so, my friends, the invitation from this story, I believe, is to come, or my invitation, I suppose, to you is to come and again walk past the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Walk past the desire in myself to say, this is what I want and I will take it. To walk past the life that I see as good and instead wait for him to bring me wisdom. May we all come and meditate and listen and learn and find true life that leads to Eden places. Amen.